Welcome to Data Analysis Made Easy with Microsoft Power Tools. And in this video, number 3, we're going to talk about reporting with pivot tables. And you will not believe some of the tricks I'm going to show you. Now, if you come to the sheet PT Notes and use Control-P for print, I created a 3-page cheat sheet all about pivot tables. That's also in the PDF notes when you download the files. Now, on toy data, this is our data set we're going to use to learn about 33 amazing tricks for pivot tables. Now, this is a sales data set with lots of fields. We have invoice number, date, time, internal toy ID number. There's another number. There's the company. There's the name of the toy, suggested age, price, units, revenue, cost of goods sold, payment method, cashier ID, whether or not they're a member, whether or not they used a coupon, the actual purchaser age, and even a column for parking validation. So we'll use this table of data to learn all about pivot tables. Now, number 1, the first thing, well, we already talked about it last video. Why do we use pivot tables instead of worksheet formulas or Power Pivot DAX M Code or Power BI? The reason is, if you're counting, summing, or creating percentages in your reports, pivot tables are easier than any of the other tools to make those types of calculations. Now, normally we choose a pivot table tool if the source data is already in the worksheet. However, later I'll show you an example where we just need to count and do a percent of column total on 7 million rows of data, and we'll see how to do that with a standard pivot table. Now, let's start at the beginning and go through each important point about a pivot table. Well, of course, the first thing is, if your data is not in a proper table, you're not going to use the pivot table feature. Second, when you want to create a pivot table, you click in a single cell in your proper data set. And instead of going to Insert Tables drop down, we use a keyboard. Now, our goal is to create a new pivot table on a new worksheet. So the keyboard is Alt-NVT, Enter. That is fast. Now, here's our pivot table field list. I'm going to click at the top and drag it over. When we create a pivot table, the data is always stored in a behind-the-scenes location called a PivotTable Cache. Now, this matters for a bunch of reasons. One is that later when we group a field like date into years or months, or a number into some frequency distribution counting category, that grouping is stored in the pivot table, and it persists. So if you create future pivot tables, even if you don't want that grouping, it's still there. Also, as we talked about last video, and we'll see later in this video, if you do not need the data in the worksheet and you're using Power Query, don't load it to the worksheet and then make a pivot table, because then you store the data in 2 locations. Just load the data directly to the PivotTable Cache. Now, if our goal is to create a report total units by product, well, we simply go to the pivot table field list, toy name, we drag it down to rows. Instantly, we get a unique list. We scroll down, units, we drag it down to the values area, and bam, there it is. A conditional sum calculation on units based on a unique list from the toy column. But wait a second, the pivot table didn't show us the field name. Now, we need to change that. So manually, you go up to Design, Layout, Report Layout, and Show in Tabular. There, we have the field name, Control-Z. Well, let's change the default setting. We go to File, Options, Data tab, Edit Default Layout. You actually can import whatever settings you have in a pivot table, but at minimum, Report Layout, I want to show it either in outline or tabular. They both will show the field name. Now when I click OK, click OK. Now, the field name doesn't show up right away, but if we create a new pivot table, Alt-NVT, Enter, drag toy name down to row, there's our default field name. Now, for the values area, if we drag a number field down to values, the default aggregate calculation is sum. If instead of units, we drag toy name because we want to count, this is a text field, so it defaults to count. Now that's called an aggregate calculation. And right click. There's two ways we can create new calculations in a pivot table. The first, summarize values by. There are 11 aggregate calculations. Now you can check out the 11 functions on the sheet summarize values by. The other one is show values as. And this is where the magic happens. It's often easier to make these types of calculations in a pivot table than it is in other tools. You can check out these 14 different amazing calculations on the sheet show values as. And we'll see some great uses for these later. Now down here in the pivot table field list, we have toy name in rows and toy name again counting in values. But we have 4 sections: rows, filter, columns, values. Rows always gives us a unique list here. Columns, if I drag payment method down to columns, well, of course, now I get a unique list across the column. 2 conditions for any intersecting value. That is a count calculation based on 2 conditions. That's counting sales transactions where the payment method was gift card and the toy was motorcycle. Now this is called a cross-tabulated report because the condition comes from the column and from the row like it was a cross. Now the filter area, let's drag coupon down to filter. And if I select, yes, they used a coupon, that condition will actually hit every single cell in the pivot table. When I click OK, that cell has 3 conditions now. Payment is gift card, product is motorcycle, and the coupon was yes. But it doesn't matter which cell I select. They all are from a record where the coupon was yes. So that means when we come to a column, every calculation here is based on the condition at the head of column, gift card. Every calculation in this row is for motorcycle, and every single calculation everywhere in the pivot table is for coupon yes. Now it's almost always better, instead of having the filter here, to show a slicer. Now I want to make sure and say all, click OK, drag this off. And now we can go up to Pivot Table Analyze, and there's the filter group. You can insert a timeline if you're dealing with time, but we want a slicer. There's coupon, click OK, and that is looking much better. I can say yes, and bam, there's our report based on a count of toy, payment method, and did they use a coupon. Now I want to show you a great slicer trick, but before we do that, I want to do 2 things. I want to name this pivot table, so right-click, Pivot Table Options, something like Crosstab Toy Count Pivot Table, click OK. I want to name the sheet, and we want to create a new pivot table here and then see how to attach the slicer to multiple pivot tables. So we come back over here, click in a single cell, Alt-NVT, but this time I want Existing, Reports, let's say L3, click OK. And this report, we want toy name, total revenue, and cost of goods sold. And unlike our beautiful DAX formulas we used last video, every time you create a new calculation in a pivot table, you have to reapply number formatting. Remember, don't use that. That applies formatting to the cells. We want to apply formatting to the field, so number formatting. Something like number, no decimals. Click OK. I did that for cost of goods sold. We'll rename the columns. Right-click, name the pivot table. Something like gross profit PT, click OK. Now we want to attach the slicer to both reports. And in fact, if I select this condition, it's only affecting that pivot table. But right-click, Report Connections. And naming is nice because it's easy to tell when you have lots of pivot tables which is which. Click OK. And so now the slicer is working on both pivot tables. Now, one other way to make a calculation in a pivot table besides these 2 is I would like to make a subtraction and subtract total revenue and cost of goods sold to get gross profit. Well, I'm going to select the pivot table, Analyze, Calculation, Field, Items, and Sets, drop down, Calculated Field. We want to name this gross profit. And right where the formula is, I want to select line revenue, double-click, minus total cost of goods sold. Now, how this makes formulas is totally different than the worksheet, totally different than DAX. Pretty much the only thing we can do is we could take fields and it defaults to sum. But this is exactly what we want here. I want whatever the total is for the condition in the row, column, and filter for revenue, and subtract, if I can do subtraction, cost of goods sold. So that formula will work. Click OK. There's our calculation in the pivot table. If we scroll down, we can see, well, it's in the field list. If we go to a different pivot table, actually the same calculated field will be there. Now up at the top here, I want to change the name, and we'll learn something important about naming columns in pivot tables. I just got rid of sum of, and when I hit Enter, it says, hey, you can't use that because that's the name of one of the fields over here. Now, a well-known trick is to add a space at the end. And then when I hit Enter, it's different because of the space, and I can enter it. Right-click, number formatting. I don't want that currency. I'll put number 0 decimal places. And so there's our gross profit calculated field. Now, a couple other housekeeping facts about pivot tables. What if we want to sort the pivot table by gross profit? Well, if we come up to the filter, these will filter the actual toy name. So come down to more options, and this is where we can say, hey, I want descending by any one of the calculations. Gross profit, click OK. Another important detail, which most people just run into by accident, is if you come to any cell in a pivot table and double click it, what is that? That's actually the records that went into making that calculation. It's the first 1,000 records that get extracted. And if you look in the upper left corner, it tells you the calculation and the conditions or criteria. Right-click, delete. And of course, with pivot tables, if the source data changes, well, pivot tables are not like worksheet formulas. We have to right-click, refresh. And sure enough, everything updates. Now, Control-Z on that and Control-Z on the change data. Now, another great trick for pivot tables is we all know that under Design, More, we have some boring options for formatting a pivot table. But there it is, New Pivot Table Style. I'm going to call this new style Blue Header. The whole table will format outside and inside. OK. Header row, format. Fill will be dark blue, my favorite. Font color will be white. Click OK. And down at the bottom, there's lots of different elements you can format, but I'm going to keep it simple. Grand row total, format. This is under font, and they have a couple different accounting underlines. So I'm going to double, make the last row, grand total row, bold. Click OK. Click OK. And now up in Design, More, there it is. You can also right-click, Set as Default. Alt-NVT, Enter. Cashier ID, total revenue, cost of goods sold, and there's my calculated field I just calculated. Come over, and I'm going to sort this report, More, and we'll show sum of revenue on top. Click OK. So HB8803254 had the most revenue. Now, a couple more important things about pivot tables. What happens when you copy a pivot table? Now, right now, there's a PivotTable Cache, and it's attached to the data on this sheet. So if I move it to a different sheet, well, it's still going to be pointing to the same table. But Control-N to open up a new workbook, Control-V. Obviously, my style did not carry over, but watch what happens. If I go up to Pivot Table Analyze, it's very important to know where to look to see where the data is coming from. Change data source. Change data source. And sure enough, there's a workbook reference. So copying a pivot table copies the source data also. Now, the group by feature is one of those features in a standard pivot table that make it attractive as a tool. Because when we group to get monthly or yearly sales or to create frequency distributions, it's often much easier than other tools. Now, we want to consider these 6 points about grouping. Over on the sheet, boom, data. Now, the first key to grouping is you have to have consistent data in the column. Now, let's try to group by year and month. Click in a single cell, Alt-NVT. Let's put this in K2, click OK. And as so many of us do every single day around the world, I'm dragging date down to rows in hopes that it automatically groups. But it doesn't. But no problem. We can force the issue. Right-click Group. And there it is. It says, cannot group this selection. I would rather the message said, hey, there's probably a data mismatch. Now with dates, it usually means there's a text date. If we scroll over, if it's a small data set, you can visually check. And sure enough, that's a text date. Control Z. Really, we probably want to run data through Power Query so we don't run into this issue. But here's a great hack. I don't want to look through this whole data set, and I don't know how many text dates there are. So I'm going to highlight the entire column. Dates are supposed to be numbers. And how do we convert text numbers back to numbers? We do any math operation that doesn't change the value. So there it is. I'm just going to add 0 to the whole column. We have some number formatting, the rest of the serial numbers. Control asterisk to highlight the whole column. I want to copy and paste special values. So watch this. Here's a great trick. Point to the edge. That's the move cursor. Don't left click. Right click and drag over. And when you let go, a secret message pops up. Copy here as values only. And bam, just like that, any text date that might have been in that column now is a real date. Uncheck. And when I drag it down, of course it's not going to group because uncheck. Right-click refresh. Remember, the source data changed. Now when we drag date down, it's going to automatically group. Now I don't like the quarters. Right-click. Go down to group. Let's uncheck quarters. Click OK. And there it is. We've successfully dealt with data mismatch. Now I added a net revenue column here to sum by month and year. We'll come back to this pivot table in a little while and see some amazing calculations. But we got to look at another grouping issue. No, it's not really an issue. It's just sometimes when you create a pivot table and group by numbers, they give you unambiguous categories like 0 to 99, 100 to 99, and so on. But other times when you create a pivot table, it creates ambiguous labels, 0 to 5,000. 5,000 is the upper limit. And then it uses 5,000 again in the next category as the lower limit. Now, this is only an issue because Microsoft doesn't give us any documentation on what's going on here. However, I'll show you exactly what's going on. Now I created a pivot table, and I want to drag units down to rows and create a frequency distribution to look at the pattern for number of units. We get a unique list, of course, but right-click Group. It gives you the min, the max, and a suggested interval. Let's start at 0. Going to 600 is fine. Increment of 100 is fine also. Click OK. And if we drag units down to values, this is a number field, but we've grouped. And so it assumes we want a frequency distribution with count. If you wanted to change it, you could. Now here we can clearly see the pattern. Most transactions are for a small number of units. But look at the categories that were created. 0 to 99, 100 to 99. There's no overlap. There's no ambiguity. The reason that this kind of category label is created is because the pivot table is programmed when there are integers in the column to create a label like that. It's a totally different thing when we have decimals. Now I created this pivot table from the net revenue column with decimals, dragged it down to rows. We get a unique list. Right-click Group. Messy numbers for the min and max. Let's change this to 0. And we want to keep it neat, so I'm going to go up to 16,000. And we'll say 5,000 as the increment. Click OK. Drag net revenue down to values. And even with the ambiguous labels, we still can see the pattern, right? Large revenue transactions are scarce. But it makes me nervous when I have categories like this, and I don't know where the 5,000 is going to go. Is it going to go in this first category or the second category? The rule is simple. The upper limit is not included. Lower limit is included. So the first category does not include 5,000. Lower limit included. Upper limit not included. So 5,000 goes there. let's try it. I'm going to change a pretty large number to 5,000. Well, nothing changed. Oh, right-click, refresh. And sure enough, 77 went to 78. Lower limit included, upper limit not. Now, it would be nice to create labels that are not ambiguous. There's a few ways to do this. We could create a label that indicates up at the top that the upper limit is not included. However, if you want to change the labels, there is a cool hack that we can use to change the labels in a pivot table. I highlight the labels, home, editing, and there's replace, or we use the keyboard Control-H. I want to search for dash, and then very carefully I put space, up, space, to, space. Replace all, and just like that, click OK, close. That's one way to indicate up to, but not including that upper limit. Now, very importantly, we want to consider what happens if I create a new pivot table, because every time we create a pivot table from that table, it's using the same cache. Does that grouping persist? When I drag units down here, sure enough, it does. But can't we just right-click ungroup? Well, we'd like to, but we can't, because the grouping is stored in the PivotTable cache. So when I ungroup, it ungroups all the reports. Control-Z. I got to show you a total hack for how to create a new pivot table with a new PivotTable cache. We're going to go all the way back to Excel 2003 or before. Now, those versions, when you created a new pivot table, every time it created a new PivotTable cache. And it dealt with the problem of grouping differently in different reports. But what it did is sometimes people would create hundreds of pivot tables, and there would be hundreds of PivotTable caches stored behind the scenes, and the file would become huge. But here you go. We definitely want a new cache. And you could add the button for the old 3-step pivot table wizard, or we just use the old Alt keyboard. So you ready? Alt-D-P. And there it is. This is what we had to do in versions 2003 and before. List or database just means I have a table. I want a pivot table. Next. That's where the data is. Next. Select Q2. Click Finish. That's dangerous, but let's try units. No problem. Right-click, group. We'll use an increment of 50. Click OK. Drag units. And bam, our second pivot table cache allows us to create a totally different grouping. All right, so remember, if you have inconsistent data and you get that error that says it can't group, go check what type of data you have. Integer data always creates unambiguous labels. Decimal data creates ambiguous labels, but now we know. And we know the upper limit is not included. And if you want a separate pivot table cache, Alt-D-P. Now let's scroll over. Now here's the year, month, net revenue report. And I'm noticing the subtotal right here. I think I want some formatting. So I'm going to go back up to Design, Pivot Table Styles, and there's the style we created. Right-click, Modify. There it is, subtotal row 1, format, something like bold. Much better. Now, the standard pivot table is awesome because it has grouping and also right-click. There are some amazing calculations that are fast and easy to do in a report, especially as compared to some of the other tools. Now, I want to add net revenue 3 times. So 1, 2, 3 times. And the goal is I want percent of grand total, percent of yearly total, and then I want both of those calculations in the same column. All right, for percent of grand total, right-click, summarize. We want to make sure it's sum. We have total sales, and now we can right-click, show values as. And there it is, percent of column total. And just like that, every single number, monthly and yearly, are compared to the grand total at the bottom of the column. I changed the label at the top. This one we want percent of year total, so right-click. Change the aggregate to sum. Right-click, show values as. And we want percent of parent total. It'll ask us, hey, what's the parent? Year. Click OK. And sure enough, all of these amounts compared to the yearly total. Now we added the label at the top, and now we want to actually combine both of these. For the individual monthly amounts, I definitely want to compare them to their parent, which is the yearly total. But when we hit the total sales for the year, I want to compare those amounts to their parent, the grand total. Now that sounds like a hard calculation, but not with a pivot table. Show values as, and we want percent of parent row total. It just knows for each item it's trying to use an enumerator to find the level above it. And so all these compare to the yearly total, but both year amounts and the one I have hidden are compared to the grand total. Now I added the label at the top. And to appreciate just how amazing and easy show values as is, let's go to the sheet DAX. Those are the DAX formulas we'd have to create to make those calculations. Similarly, over on worksheet, that's a worksheet formula that just does some of what we did in just a few clicks with the show value as pivot table feature. Now we do want to add a few more fields and look at other show value as calculations. There's the 5th revenue and the 6th. Now the next calculation, I just want to see the actual dollar amount change from month to month. Right click, summarize, we'll do sum. Right click, show values as, and difference from. It wants to know difference from what? Month is fine, and we want previous. Click OK. I added some number formatting and changed the label at the top. If we look at this number right here, that's calculated by taking the smaller number for March and subtracting the bigger number from February. So net revenue went down by $69,000. We can right click and show this as a percent. Percent different from. We definitely want month, and please do it every month based on the previous month. And so this 9% is completely wrong because look, that's negative. Right click. I forgot to change summarize values by to sum. And so now we have almost a 16% reduction from February to March in net revenue. Another calculation that we want sometimes is a cumulative or running total. We would like a running total for month, adding each subsequent month's sales until in December, we have the total for the year. So we'll drag net revenue down for the 7th and 8th time. Right click, summarize sum, and then we'll change show values as, and there it is, running total in, and it wants to know running total in what? We definitely want month. Click OK. So now we can see according to these net revenues, we're adding until we get exactly the total accumulated for the entire year by the end of December. Now we can do percent running total. We'll say in month. And now right here we can say we've accumulated about 75% of the revenue for the entire year by the end of September. All right, so if your project allows for you to use a pivot table and you're making these calculations, wow, are they easy. Now, so far in this video, we have covered all of the basics of pivot tables and seen some examples of when they are amazing, quick, and fast. But we got to see 6 examples of when the pivot table is the perfect tool to use. We're going to see a survey example, crosstab and visual, joint probability, which is from statistics and is sort of mind-boggling. We'll see 7 million rows into a PivotTable cache, append multiple files into cache, and then we'll save the granddaddy of them all, the #1 pivot table trick that none of the other tools can do, for last. Now, the first example, well, we all know how to do this, and we've already done this in the class. But as a practical example of when to use a pivot table, I can't think of a better example than summarizing survey results. Now let's try this. We're going to click in the cell Alt-NVT. We'll put it in D5, click OK. Survey results down to row, drag down to values twice, right click. Show values as, percent of column total. And just like that, we have survey results. Wow, it looks like Coca-Cola and Coke dominated Pepsi, RC Cola, and Shasta Cola. Another common pivot table task is to create a cross-tabulated report. In this example, we want to look at customer age and its relationship to payment method. On the sheet, boom.com sales, Alt-NVT. I want to try and put it on crosstab and visual. Cell B10, click OK. Payment method goes to column. Age is going to go to rows. Right-click, group. The min will be 16. The max will be 71. And we'll increment by 7. Click OK. Customer age down to values. And bam, there's our crosstab table. And it clearly seems like younger people are using PayPal and Visa. Older customers are definitely not using PayPal, but they're using Visa just as much. Lots of other discoveries here also. And it's easy to visualize from a crosstab because we use either clustered or stacked column or bar, insert. Charts over to dropdown, we'll do clustered. I want to emphasize the totals for the variable on the horizontal axis. So right-click, change the chart type, and we want stacked. We still get the detail from the legend, but now we can clearly see younger people, 23 to 29, are purchasing the most boomerangs. We can also see that PayPal is pretty significant and big through younger ages. Green arrow, chart title, equal sign, select cell C7, and enter. Now another amazing thing for cross-tabulated tables is in statistics we have something called a joint probability table. And it's quite profound how many different types of probability you can get from a table like this. Well, joint probability is based on a crosstab, so I'm going to copy this, come over to joint probability, select B4, Control V. Right-click. We definitely want count, show values as, and this is where we want grand total. I want every single number compared to the grand overall total. Now the business took their data from the past and created a joint probability table. And we can make statements about the probability that a random customer selected would. Well, the first probability is we just want to find what is the probability of selecting a customer between 23 and 29. Now, there's different parts in a joint probability table. All the probabilities in what is called the margin are probabilities based on counts with a single condition. So in that case, you just take the probability that's already been calculated from the margin. So the probability that we randomly select someone in that age group, 24.5%. Now, that probability uses a single condition. But we can have two. We can run an AND or an OR logical test. Now, the AND logical test takes advantage of two variables. Hey, we have PayPal, and we have this age category. The intersecting value is called a joint probability or a probability based on an AND logical test. It's the probability that we select a random person in this age group and they used PayPal. So here we simply equals the pre-calculated probability. What about calculating the probability that the person is in this age group given that they already used Visa? Well, if we go and look over here, the total sample space is 200. Visa, there's only 66 customers. And a conditional probability means the sample space changes. So we're only going to use values from this column. Equals whatever the intersecting value is for 51 to 57 who used Visa divided by the margin at the bottom. And that's our conditional probability. Now, we can definitely do OR logical test, but anytime you do an OR logical test, you have to worry about double counting. We want the probability for randomly selecting a customer and they were this age group or they used Visa. Equals, well, you get both of the margins. So here's the probability that they were in that age group plus the probability that they used Visa. And we have to subtract the overlap, the AND logical test. And there it is. That's the probability of randomly selecting a person 44 to 50, or they used payment method Visa. And of course, the point is pivot tables are easy. If we had to do these probabilities with formulas based on the original data set, that just seems a lot harder. All right, now let's go over to the sheet 7 million rows. Now we have an SQL Server database that we're going to connect to, and it has 7 million rows of data. And all we need in our report is frequency and percent frequency. So if we could get this into a pivot table, we could use show values as percent of column total. Now, we are going to import this data and load it into the PivotTable cache. Now, the file will get pretty big, but if this is all you need and you're in a hurry, this is a great trick. If you need to compress the data, then you send it to the data model. And then the formulas for a calculation like this are a lot more complicated. But let's see how to do this. Data, get data from database, SQL Server database. Here's your credentials here. They're right in the workbook. pond.highline.edu is the server. Boom data is the database. Click OK. We're definitely using database. Username, excelisfun. That's all lowercase. I typed the password in, but here it is. Capital E, XCEL, capital I, S, capital F, UN, exclamation point. Let's click Connect. No problem. It's not encrypted, so click OK. All we want is one table, F transactions. Click Transform Data. Now I'm going to take two columns here, product and quantity, even though we're not going to use quantity in this example, but I might do other calculations later. Right-click, remove other columns. Now we can close and load two. Send this to the PivotTable cache on a new worksheet. No, I want it right here. Click OK. All right, here we go. Product down to rows. Product down to values twice. Right-click. We got count, which is what we want. We want to do a frequency, and percent of column total. Now, most of the time, we're going to send our big data to the data model because the file size will be a lot smaller. But if you need a quick pivot table report, the PivotTable cache can handle big data. All right, let's go over to our finale example for this video on Append to Cache 1. Now, we've been given this folder, Boom Tournament Results. And from various cities across the United States, we have Boomerang Tournament results. These are CSV files. We need to append them into a single table and then calculate who's the overall winner and the winner for each separate event. Now, this is what one of the CSV files look like. Thrower, event, and score. Those are the only fields in each table. This is what the end result should look like. We definitely want overall results, so some sort of grouping or pivot table that adds the total points and then ranks. But then I want the same report many times, one for each event. Now, the amazing pivot table feature we're going to use is called Show Report Filter. This does not exist in Power Pivot. Now, in Power BI Desktop, you can use multiples for charts like column. But I don't know how to do it with all these tables. All right, let's go over to the sheet, Show Report Filter. We want to import those CSV files. So data, get data from file, from folder. Now, I see my folder, and I'm going to double click. There's the folder path. There's no files because this feature just imports whatever's in Boom Tournament Results. Click Open. We want to click Transform. All right, now in the content column, there's something called a binary. And a binary is a sequence of bytes like in a CSV, Excel, or XML file. We have these files in a column, and we need to extract the table of data for each row. Luckily, there's a function called csv.document that does exactly that. We want to add a column, custom column. I'm going to call this Get CSV Tables. And down here where the formula goes, csv.document, open parentheses. And there's lots of arguments that we'll study later in this class. But when you have a CSV file, we can just double click the column that contains those files, content, close parentheses. It assumes that the delimiter is a comma. And when I click OK, I have a new column over here. If I select off to the side, well, the tables are looking good, except for we need to promote the first row as a header. We're actually going to come up to the formula bar, and there's that lovely function working on each row. But what do I need to do to that table? Promote header. So I'm going to edit up in the formula bar very carefully, clicking after each. Then I'm going to type a space, And like so many of the M code functions, this function we're going to use is named smartly table.promoteHeaders. That's all it does is promote our headers. Notice it needs a table. Well, we have a table there, close parentheses at the end. I'll use my check mark. And now in each row, that is amazing. I didn't have to import each one of these by hand and do everything manually and then manually append. I imported them in a folder, created this extra column. And now I don't need any of the other columns. I come to this column, right-click, remove other columns. Now, one way to append all of these tables, as long as the structure of each table in each row is the same, we can use the expand button. Later in the class, we'll see how to use another option called table.combine. But let's click expand. It's asking if we want these columns. We do, but we definitely don't want to use original column name as part of the new column name. So I uncheck that. Click OK. And there you go. All the CSV files are in a single table. I want to add data types. And one great way to almost always get it right is to go to Transform. And right there, Detect Data Types. When you use that feature, it adds a step. Just make sure it got each one of these correct. And sure enough, it got each one correct. ABC for text, ABC, and 1, 2, 3 for whole number. Now we want to remove all the spaces from our identifiers. Now you can name the identifiers what you like. That's what I named them. Now we can come up to Home, Close and Load to, into a pivot table report, click OK. All right, we want a unique list of throwers. We'll drag score down twice. Now I want to come to the second column and right-click down to Summarize. Sum is what we want to do some other type of calculation to. Show values as. Rank largest to smallest. Most points win. On thrower, click OK. Looks like Isaac got most points. Richard got second. Stevie, Will Gix. Now in the final report, I definitely want it sorted by either one of these columns because they'll give us the same sort order. So more sort, descending, biggest on top, sum of score. Now we can add some field names and number formatting. Now the moment of truth is, this is fine. This is overall total. Isaac won, Richard got second. But I want to know the rank and the scores for each event. Well, there it is. You drag it down to filter. Now remember, earlier in this video, we said, hey, filter is great, but usually we use slicers. But in this case, this trick only works if you drag it down to filters. It says all, but we know there's lots of different events there. Now we go up to Pivot Table Analyze. Pivot Table Group, Options, Dropdown, and there it is, Show Report Filter Pages. Show which one? For event. And watch what happens down here. Instantly, it'll add a new sheet for each event. So click OK. And there's accuracy on a new sheet, Aussie round, endurance, fast catch, MTA, trick catch, and there's the overall. Pivot tables rule. Wow, that was an epic video all about pivot tables. We saw how to append tables into the PivotTable Cache. We saw the amazing Show Report Filter feature to create a bunch of reports with a single click. We saw how to load 7 million rows of data to the PivotTable Cache. We talked about joint probability tables and how varied they are for probabilities. We talked about crosstabs, about survey data and how easy it is to summarize with a pivot table. We also looked at worksheet formulas and DAX formulas that were a lot harder than the amazing show values as feature in a pivot table. And we talked about the difference between grouping when you have integers and decimals. We talked about pivot table styles. And we started it off with a complete review of the amazing pivot table feature. All right, we'll see you next Dame MPT video.